Hey, I'm Smooneychad, and this is Kerbal Space Program, a game that I build a lot of planes in. In fact, that's pretty much all I do on this channel. So I figured it was high time that I finally try my hand at rocketry again, and what better place to start than trying to build the most cursed rocket that I possibly can. This monstrosity combines my version of the first stage of New Glenn, which was lost on its maiden voyage back in January, just over top of the Bermuda Triangle. And the second stage is, of course, a really messed up starship, which is in a bit of a rough patch. And our goal today is to somehow turn this atrocity into a full-fledged reusable rocket, landing the first stage out at sea on a ship, and the second stage back at the KSP. But to do this, we're going to have to head somewhere we haven't been in a very, very long time, the VAB. And first things first, we're going to grab a Jumbo 64 tank, the classic orange tank, and then stick a mandatorily crewed command pod on here, because that's the Kerbal thing to do. Now at first I was going to add the exact same kind of starship engine setup, but it turned out that it didn't really fit since this is really, really tiny to be a starship. So instead we're going to be using a cursed 4-swivel engine setup instead. And I put those on a EP25 engine plate, and we're going to be using that to get the Starship engine skirt with this little nose cone trick on there. I'm pretty sure that helps with drag too. But what it doesn't help with is the sheer weight of these hinges. These are going to be used to make the flaps on Starship, of course, and I decided to go with the beefiest ones because I really wanted all the torque I could get. These, of course, are stock DLC, whatever you want to call them, but we're going to be using procedural wings for the actual wing parts on the flaps. Now, I'm not going for an exact one-to-one replica of Starship here by any means, so these are just going to be what I think looks good and kind of works, given the limitations here of this design in Kerbal Space Program. Now you can see that the flaps kind of clip into the vehicle whenever they're fully extended or retracted, so we're going to be setting the minimums here so that whenever we set up the actual pitch control with those, they're not just flapping around inside the vehicle, because that wouldn't probably perform good or look good. Now we're going to be setting up the rear flaps here, and those are going to be quite a bit beefier. They're going to be heavy all the way around, which puts a lot of weight at the rear of the vehicle, honestly, which might actually give me trouble later. And here's our nearly finished design, which looks ugly as can be, but we're going to fix that by making it stainless steel, because silvery stainless steel just fixes everything. After that, we're going to add some completely inadequate landing legs on here, and then move on to just putting a battery on this thing, because it's going to be draining a lot of power with those hinges flapping back and forth every time we try to pitch up and pitch down. And to give us some extra control, especially in space, we're going to be adding these RCS thrusters on board that will actually feed from the fuel on board rather than RCS monopropellant. I put 8 of these on here and tilted them a little bit to add some roll control. I also completely disabled the reaction wheels on here so that it's only the flaps and the RCS controlling it. And speaking of the flaps, it's time to actually set those up. We're going to go into the Action Groups menu here and click on Pitch, and then bind both hinges to the pitch axis and turn the control mode from incremental to absolute. This should make them work pretty much the exact same way that control surfaces do. But to make sure that this actually pitches up and down, we need to set one set of the hinges to reverse control and one set to normal control, which can be a little bit difficult to figure out which one you need at what, so we're just going to take this out to the pad for its maiden test flight. Once we're out on the pad, it's immediately apparent we have a bit of a leaning problem. But we're going to test out those flaps anyway, and as you can see, they're already kind of working. And just here on the ground, I'm going to imagine this is in a belly flop and pitch up and down and see if this would actually pitch it up and down, and yeah, it turns out the directions are actually correct for this. But the wiggling around and leaning is not correct, so we're going to need to fix that. At first, I'm going to try just adding some more of the exact same landing legs on here, and yeah, it looks kind of stupid, but it kind of sort of works, and we're going to take this off for our first proper test flight, which isn't going very well, but you can immediately see that the flaps do actually work somewhat to control this thing and keep it oriented in a good old belly flop, but it wasn't really working how I expected it to. So we're going to take this off on another test flight and try out some different control modes on this. And I think those RCS and the engine vectoring are doing some really heavy lifting for it. But we're going to try to get this up high enough to actually properly test a belly flop, which is a little bit easier said than done. Luckily, it seems to get a little bit more stable when going at high speed, so once we picked up past like 150 meters per second, we were finally able to get enough height to actually test it properly. And of course, on board as our pilot is Jebediah Kerman, because it is mandatorily manned, or Kerbal, I guess. And we're going to be trying to land in the water here just to increase his survival odds by a little bit. And with how hard this is to control, I'm honestly surprised that he even made it this far. But we immediately ran into a little bit of a problem with the whole belly flop thing. It just wants to fly like an airplane. That's not intentional, I swear. I know I build a lot of airplanes, but yeah, it just wants to fly like a plane. As you can see here, we're just flying right along. It's got some real downrange capability. Unfortunately, it has almost no landing capability. So we crash right here into the ocean, killing Jeb. In a simulation, of course. So we went back to the VAB, and I decided to add some control tabs so we actually have roll and yaw control, which we don't at all right now because of the limitations with the hinges. And of course, I added a vertical stabilizer to add extra curse points to this. And we're just going to go ahead and add some huge landing legs on this, just the regular stock ones. And as you can see, they're a lot more stable, and that immediately helped with our takeoff, along with the control tabs probably. And we're actually ascending somewhat vertically, which is pretty surprising compared to the last launches. Something else that helped with this was putting atmospheric autopilot in rocket mode rather than the normal plane mode, and that really helped. Here you can see we've got the vapor cones mod, adding some cool vapor cones to this, and we blazed right past supersonic up into the upper atmosphere for our first proper belly flop. And as you can see, it's going pretty darn well already. And we're actually falling straight down rather than flying forward like before. And up here at this altitude, it actually seemed really stable with almost no input outside of RCS just doing its thing. But once we got a little bit lower, we started yawing around in a circle, which I guess is along with proper Starship lore. Maybe not in the belly flop though. And even though we have a goofy vertical stabilizer, it's not really doing much. So we're just going to go ahead and turn and burn while we're spinning. And although it's not the best, I'd say it's a significant improvement over the previous launches, especially since Jeb actually lived this time, though he probably got pretty shaken up. So we're going to go finish up this design and hopefully the quirks will work themselves out. First things first, we actually need a payload on this thing because instead of a payload bay, we have a crew capsule up there. So we're going to add one in the middle between the crew capsule and the rest of the tanks. And as you can see, I went ahead and added a reaction wheel on it because that's probably the only way that we're going to solve this without just hours and hours of tweaking. I ran into a little bit of an issue with the payload bay color matching to the rest of the ship though, so I ended up just painting everything white. And just to keep our batteries topped off, I went ahead and added one of these wraparound solar panels from Sterling Systems, and we're out at the pad. Unfortunately, I forgot to deploy the landing legs before launching, but that's an easy enough fix, and we're off on our hopefully last test flight. And it's going semi-okay. A little bit of a pitching problem back and forth, but that solves itself once you get up to high enough speed, and we're able to actually keep this thing in a pretty good attitude. As you can see, it gets pretty stable. But the ultimate test is going to be seeing if this thing still belly flops pretty good, and if we're actually able to land it. I was aiming for the runway and missed a little bit and almost landed on my ramp from one of the past videos that I made, so I ended up just going for the grass next to the pad, and more or less unintentionally turned around. I wasn't actually using the flaps at all there. Since we actually had a lot of fuel on board, because I did launch this with full fuel, I had to start the burn really early to get down to a slow enough speed. As we approached the ground though, I kind of had trouble keeping it from drifting off, and it tippy-toed for a little bit and then finally tipped back over onto landing legs and gave us our first landing of the second stage here. And I think it looks pretty darn good out here. Cursed, but good. But there's a whole nother half of the rocket that we still need to make. So we're going to head back over to the VAB and get started on that. And despite my best efforts, I couldn't figure out a way to make the booster manned, so we're just going to be using a probe core instead. As you can see, the booster is pretty much the same size as the second stage, which is pretty goofy, and it has very low thrust-to-weight ratio, near 1, which is probably going to give us something like that one Astra rocket launch that went sideways. But we're just going to continue with everything and figure that out later. And the first order of business is getting those Blue Origin New Glenn strakes on the side there, and they're a little bit oversized if you can't tell, but I got the inspiration directly from the man himself.
So we did this, we kept doing these trades, and the strakes always wanted to be bigger.
And so the strakes will be bigger, along with those definitely not grid fins at the top. And while placing the definitely not grid fins trademark at the top, I remembered that the New Glenn booster is actually widened at the bottom, which should definitely help us with our thrust to weight problems because I can squeeze even more swivel engines on the bottom. Now this is far more engines than the New Glenn booster actually has, but you know, the more engines the merrier, and it looks really darn cool, I think. But I think it kind of more or less ruined the beauty of the New Glenn booster, which is probably one of the prettiest rockets out there. The oversized strakes and the really weird proportions on this just kind of messed everything up, but we're going to roll with it anyway and go ahead and stick the Starship on top of it. One of the last touches is going to be some launch clamps so we don't have any more tilting around problems, especially with this being much taller. And then we're going to add a test payload into the bay on the Starship, which is going to be around 14 tons, and this will be the first proper test flight. And here's the Starflop Super Greg on the launch pad for the very first time, which is what I named it while I was building it for some reason. We're going to be lighting the engines before unclamping because that is the proper way to do it, and we barely have any thrust-to-weight ratio at all. It's something like 1.1 off the pad. And immediately I noticed that something was wrong. Something was torquing the whole rocket around violently despite all the many control surfaces and RCS we have all over this thing. And we had to kind of ditch into the water here and undock the little Starflop and try to land it. Fortunately, it was able to get off a pretty good belly flop there, but not able to slow down in time to save the whole ship, just the crew. So after tweaking around with it for a bit, I figured out that the issue was to do with the flaps being retracted on takeoff, or just about halfway on takeoff. That was causing some kind of weird pitching moment to one side. So I went ahead and made those locked in the straight out position, and that's going to allow us to just unlock them before we re-enter or use them for anything, and they'll just stay completely straight on the launch, which looks a lot better too. And just take note how slowly this thing lifts off once it's unclamped. It absolutely just crawls into the sky for the first bit, but it is flying a lot better than before, and I have almost complete control of it, and we're able to get it into a nice little attitude like this and kind of use those wings facing into the airstream for some extra lift. I remember someone mentioning that about New Glenn, and it kind of helps it out, so we're just going to use the Starship flaps for that too, and maybe get even more gains out of it. Since this was the first launch, I kind of had no clue how to do the whole gravity turn and everything for this particular ship, so I just kind of winged it, and I think it worked out pretty okay. And here at about 20 kilometers, it's time to stage the booster and send it off on its way. And of course, we're not going to be doing actual hot staging, even though we have a fake hot staging ring, because it's not very heat resistant and would probably just melt immediately. And we're just going to be continuing with the Starflop here and leaving the booster behind. We'll be coming back to it using the FMRS mod, which does some save magic and allows us to actually go land it without messing up whatever we do with the ship here. Right around here, though, we finally pushed the apoapsis out into space, and it was time to just coast out to the peak of our orbit and do a quick circularization burn. I was actually surprised with how much delta V we had left over after circularizing our orbit, kinda, especially given we had a 14-ton payload on board. We had over 704 meters per second of delta V left, but we kind of need that much delta V because I have absolutely no clue still how to land this thing, and we'll probably need some extra on the landing burn. I just aimed for a random spot that looked like it may be ocean, which is kind of hard to tell with the whole volumetric clouds. And here's the re-entry in both regular re-entry effects and then Firefly, because I didn't actually have these beautiful Firefly effects, which look honestly pretty realistic for Starship, but I didn't have them installed yet on this save when recording this, so we'll just have to go with the retcon re-entry here, and then go back to the old school re-entry effects on the actual way down. As you can see, the whole belly flop through the atmosphere actually worked out really well for the little Starship clone here, but we went right into a cloud bank and I had no clue what kind of terrain was beneath us. So we just kind of have to wing it once again and fall right through the clouds and hope that there's some semi-level ground underneath. But it turns out that this thing actually performs really well with the whole landing procedure whenever its tanks are nearly empty, which makes it doubly unfortunate that we landed on a mountain, and that just doesn't work out very well when you have such a very top-heavy design. I went back to a quick save to see if there was some kind of ocean near that we could land on, because I know that that will be a semi-safe landing, and that works out pretty good for the first test flight to splash it down in the ocean rather than trying to land on hard ground, which is a lot less forgiving, especially in KSP. So we used some of the extra fuel and ended up just basically flying this like a plane, practicing our massive cross-range capability in this. And if you haven't noticed yet, I really don't even have to do the whole flip maneuver with the flaps, because it actually kind of just starts flying butt backwards whenever you're at slow speed coming into the ground, which is good for landing, I guess, but really not the way that things should work. But I accidentally kind of misjudged the distance to the water here, and so we hovered for a bit before coming to a relatively soft landing. But now it's time to use the power of the FMRS mod to go all the way back in time, past the orbit and the re-entry and everything, to the whole booster staging. And unlike the ship, this is actually the very first test flight of the booster, so we have absolutely no idea how it's actually going to behave. Now initially here, when it's at the top of the orbit and there's not a lot of air up here, it's not going to really be able to stabilize well until it gets a little bit speed picked up and gets down into the lower atmosphere. And then we get a little bit too much control over it, but that's fine as long as we're a little bit careful. Turns out those strikes actually work really good for bleeding off a lot of extra speed, because there's not as much margin for error in the booster here. We only have 380 some meters per second of delta V, and that goes down a lot when using the RCS to help control it. I light up the engines to around full power at 800 meters and then back them off, because there's a lot of thrust to weight ratio when this thing is almost completely empty like this. And we had a incredibly good landing here, probably as good as you could ask for the very first try, but there's just something missing. The nuclear booster was intended to land on a ship, but to do that, we need a ship. So I headed over to the spaceplane hangar and started looking through the parts. I found these Mk3 saddle tanks from the Mk3 Stockalike Expansion mod, and I found out if you scaled them up, they pretty much just look like a ship hull. So I just went ahead and took all of the different parts, scaled them all up, and stuck them together, and slowly but surely, we got a pretty convincing ship hull out of this. And as far as I know, I don't think anyone's ever done this before, so I'm not even sure that this thing will float, and it also has a huge RCS thruster in the rear, which we immediately disabled because that thing's kinda scary. And after that, I just hopelessly auto-strutted everything together, and then added a quick probe core to this and just clipped it down inside of the ship hull. Before we waste too much time on this ship, I gotta see if it actually floats, and it turns out it does that pretty darn well. I used one of the mods that I have to spawn this out in the water, and yeah, it floats really darn well. It's a little bit bouncy though, but if you give it a little bit of time with the physics on, it does finally stabilize itself and sit there nicely like a big old ship. But I'd like to actually make this look a little bit more like a boat rather than just like a background PS1 graphic. So I'm using these procedural wing parts without the lifting on to make a little bit of a railing / bulwark around the front of the bow here. It's not much, but it's at least an attempt to make this look slightly better than what it looks like. But all of that's about to go down the drain because I'm adding this as the bridge, which, not even in hindsight, it looks awful. But we're in a hurry to catch boosters, so I rolled with that and added a massively scaled up Goliath engine because propellers don't really work underwater in KSP. And then one of these little trucks just like, I don't even know, I'm speechless at that. But moving on to the last step, we're just going to add a rudder to this and we should be ready to go test it. Out on the water, it's immediately apparent I forgot to auto-strut the front here, the bridge, but that was a quick fix and we're off to the races. Quite literally, because it turns out this thing is very fast, especially for a ship. It's going 61 meters per second, and this thing's pretty large. It's a pretty big accomplishment, I would say, for a boat. It's good news for us because we might need to travel a pretty long ways with this thing to get out to the booster catch location, and traveling with a boat in KSP tends to be fairly boring, same as with roving around. We're going to move the bridge over here in a small attempt to make this look slightly better and open up our deck space for maximum rocket catching capability. And here's a nice flyby of this thing just drifting along, because that's what it does whenever you try to turn it. It does not turn very well, which might just come back to bite us later. I went ahead and recovered that and quickly loaded up the Super Greg for a quick launch, which seems kind of random, especially since we haven't positioned the ship yet, but that's exactly what this is for. We're going to take this up on a pretty much normal routine flight, and then disconnect the booster and stay in control of the booster and just quickly see where it lands at. We're going to use that position to then place the ship somewhere near there, so we have a good estimation of where this booster will come down at, so it can maneuver toward the ship and actually land on it. Which is much easier said than done, obviously, because this is actually still only our second test run, so this does give me a slight opportunity before the main flight to practice landing it, and as you can see, I'm excelling at that. But despite the bad landing, this is still good enough to tell where to put the boat, and it's going to be somewhere right out here, just about half again as far as the island. We're going to take the boat out there, land the booster on it, and hopefully sell the boat all the way back to the KSC. In a perfect world. And first things first, it's time to actually position the boat, which took quite a bit of time, but not that long given that this has a pretty good speed on it. And I found out that since we're using a Goliath engine, we can actually put it into reverse thrust and kind of stop on a dime with this thing. So we're just going to leave it out there and go ahead and load up the star flop with some fake Starlink satellites that I'm going to be calling the Star Clonks, and that only weighs about 2 tons, so it's a pretty light payload for this whole rocket, especially given how huge and wasteful it is. But we're going to get this beautiful aesthetic launch here as this thing slowly crawls its way up into the sky and into the sun rays coming out above the VAB, which I think looked really good. This came out as a really good shot, but there's very little time for aesthetics when we have our first real mission to complete. So we're going to go ahead and stage the booster and continue on to orbit with the Star Flop second stage. We're going to again get into a roughly circular orbit with this, and we're going to go ahead once we're there and warp around to the daylight side so we can actually see what we're doing. And this ended up being pretty nice looking in and of itself, with the Star Flop coming around here to the day side. And to release these, I'm going to use the RCS to tip the Star Flop up and then tip it back down as soon as we release the payload. And as you'll see here, it gives a little bit of momentum to the Star Clonks there and allows them to separate. And oh, they separate because they're stuck together with only stack separators, which ended up making a bit of a space junk disaster here, as you can see, which honestly kind of sparked my interest in just making complete Kessler syndrome in low Kerbal orbit, which is something I think I'll be doing from here out. We're going to be leaving that in orbit though and coming back to our booster and actually trying to land it. You can see down there in the little purple square, that's the ship that we're going to be landing on, and we're going to be using the trajectories mod to line up our falling trajectory there with the ship. This would be really hard to do without that mod, because it allows me to kind of do some quick little maneuvers like that right there to get this lined up before we're in the deeper parts of the atmosphere, and maneuvers like that are nearly impossible or very expensive. Once we get in that stage of flight where we're still gaining speed on the way down, we start getting some really good atmospheric control, and we're able to steer this around and burn off a lot of that speed later on. You can see we immediately went subsonic there, which is really helping with our fuel savings, but it doesn't really help the fact that I have a really bad aim. We got fairly close to the boat, and then the boat just exploded for absolutely no reason and sent shrapnel up into the atmosphere at very high velocity. Why this happened? I don't know. But I kept at it and kept the hope alive, time after time after time, of many explosions with this booster. Eventually, though, I was kind of starting to get the hang on how to operate this, cycling back and forth between normal SAS and the atmosphere autopilot in rocket mode. Using that combo with pointing retrograde, I was able to get some pretty good landings. But eventually, I was able to get some really good landings, not blowing up the ship or the rocket in the process. And I figured out this whole method of underflying the target and then kind of cross-ranging out to it to burn off even more velocity to have some extra landing fuel, because we were cutting it pretty darn close. And here was one of the best attempts. I came down here and lit the engines a little bit early, and they died right before the landing. But we actually managed to land it on the boat. I was very ecstatic with this and immediately started taking back off toward the KSC, but it had other plans. And it turns out that it didn't have a single quick save with it actually on the ship, so I had to keep at it and try to land this again, hopefully in a better position on the ship. But it turns out that that was more luck than skill, and 4 hours later, I finally got another promising attempt at landing. Actually redid the boost back burn and got a much more steep trajectory right over top of the ship for these next attempts, and that turned out to work a lot better. I haven't mentioned that I absolutely love the Vapor Cones mod for landing boosters. It just looks so sick whenever you go subsonic and you get that Vapor Cone on there, even if it is fairly low quality compared to like Firefly. But as you can see, we're dead center on the ship, and I lit up early at a low throttle and then slowly backed it up and then back down as landing, but ran out of fuel at the very last second. Luckily, as it fell, it actually landed without blowing anything up, and after teetering around for a bit, we had it pretty darn dead center on the ship after probably 100 tries. And I was very, very happy with this, though it didn't feel as good as pulling it off after just a few tries earlier. But after that last attempt that landed on it, I know we're not out of the woods yet, and we actually have to get this back to the KSC, which is way, way, way easier said than done, given all of the very slippery physics in KSP. No matter how slow I move the ship, the booster appears just going to gradually slide off or tip over, which luckily I had a quick save this time with the booster on the back, so I decided to use this method of slowly lowering it down using the spring strength on the landing legs until it's actually laying on its side here on the ship. I was thinking that that would hopefully provide more friction and help us get it back to the KSC, but it turns out that that didn't even work either, and for some reason our engine randomly flew off. So I just figured that there was no way that this was happening, so I had to just cut my losses and recover it out here. But back up in Kessler Syndrome land, we have a whole star flop to land still, back at the KSC. Luckily, I've gotten fairly good at lining up my trajectory to land back at the KSC, especially thanks to the Trajectories mod again, and so that was a fairly easy process, and we used this method of tilting side to side the same way you would with like an SSTO or spaceplane to line up with where I thought the launch pad was. The thing is, that little marker there with the flag on it I was aiming for actually marks the runway, and as soon as we came down into this very thick cloud bank and all the way through it, I figured that out really quick, and so I realized that we were quite a bit away from where I was trying to land at back at the launch pad, which was pretty clear it was going to be very difficult to land there because I couldn't even make it to the runway here because of all the control issues that this has. But it does glide really well at a very certain angle. Unfortunately, the landing part is a lot more difficult. This thing feels absolutely uncanny to control and doesn't want to do anything that you want it to do. It's like it has a complete mind of its own. And right here, as we were aiming for the actual launch pad, which you can kind of see through the clouds there, it wasn't really working out for us too well, and it started spinning out of control and flying backwards again. But by some miracle, it flew backwards in just the right way to get into the perfect trajectory to land so smoothly, just meters away from the launch pad. So I'm gonna call that mission complete. It's plenty good enough for me, at least. So after recovering that, I went ahead and took another Starflop stack out to the launch pad to watch the sunset, which seems a little bit odd, but I swear to you I have a reason, because if you look closely here and hold down Alt, thanks to the Distant Object Enhancer mod, you can actually see all the debris we just put in the low Kerbal orbit, just flying by up there as little tiny specks in the night sky. But that's not enough for me. So I decided for the next few videos, I would try and master reusable rocketry in KSP using a absolute ton of mods, even more than the aircraft only series, and try to pollute low Kerbal orbit as much as possible in the process. For absolutely no reason, but I think that'd be pretty fun. So thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to use the mods I used in this video, I actually have a complete version of the pack that I'm using up on my website and on my Discord called the Beyond Aircraft pack. It's like the aircraft only pack that I made, but it has even more mods in it that allow you to build all sorts of things, not just aircraft. Hopefully ultimately fleshing out the game to what KSP 2 should have been. That's all I've got for today. Thank you so much for watching. This is Smooneychad, out.